Hello.
Howdy, howdy.
How you doing?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you for asking.
Good, good, good. Um, okay, so what we're doing today is we're going to be watching an interview with a guy who wrote a book about Clarence Thomas, and obviously the Supreme Court has been in the news quite a lot the last year or two.
Particularly Clarence Thomas.
Particularly Clarence Thomas, yeah. This guy wrote a book about that's going to try to teach us more about his background and more about like why he makes the type of judicial decisions that he does. And I think he's trying to frame it in terms of Black conservatism more broadly. But I'm not super familiar with this guy, so we'll just see what he's got to say. Do you have anything else you want to add?
Just get everything going on my OBS and it'll be good to go.
Okay.
And then let me share my picture in picture.
Can we turn it up a little?
Oh, yeah.
That's just very quiet. I can't hear it almost at all.
Thought.
That's good. Thank you.
And these are academics, and it was all liberals and leftists, and the people that everybody loves in the African American tradition. And they realized they had no conservatives there, and so they had to add one. And Clarence Thomas was the logical person. And I think, like many people, all I really knew about Clarence Thomas was Anita Hill. Basically, that was kind of the extent of it. And I was just shocked to discover the story of this man, his past, which we'll talk about more, and not just his past as a Black nationalist on the left, but the persistence of that influence on his jurisprudence. And was doubly shocked that nobody seemed to know about it or talk about it. There's a very famous opening line in Ralph Ellison's novel Invisible Man, which is the epigraph for my book, and it's told from the point of view of the narrator, who's Black, and says, you don't see me. You always see somebody else. And the enigma of Clarence Thomas is not just about Clarence Thomas. It's really about the country, many of whose citizens don't actually see this man and what he is saying. And so I think there was just a puzzle to me about this person who was hiding in plain sight.
So as you've just said, the driving thesis of the book, is people watching might already know, is that Clarence Thomas is and has always been a Black nationalist of some variety, from his days in college when he was devoted to Malcolm X, all the way up through his present tenure on the Supreme Court bench. So could you describe, just to set the scene, like the first part of that arc, like what was he like in his youth?
When he was testifying before Congress, before the Senate committee, he was asked by Senator Howell Heflin, who was the senator from Alabama, very thick Alabama accent that I won't try to imitate. And he was asked, what was your major in college? And he said, English literature. And he said, and then he was asked, what was your minor? And he said, protest. Clarence Thomas was a campus militant. He came to Holy Cross in 1968. He was part of a remarkable class of young Black men who had been recruited to start the process of integration. Very illustrious class of young Black men who would go on to make their mark in a variety of venues. And they formed early on the Black Student Union, which was already a choice, a political choice, to use that term of art, Black. It had been popular on the West Coast, not so much on the East Coast among campus students. And they had a manifesto. and Clarence Thomas was the Secretary of Treasury. He typed it up. And it has been 3 years since I wrote this book, so I don't remember all the specifics, but it was straight out of kind of a black nationalist, black separatist pantheon. Black men should not be involved romantically with black women. Black men are the source of pride and salvation for the black community. Black people need to have their own institutions, and so on and so forth. And Thomas, these weren't just words for him. He was active. He participated in all kinds of activities. The most famous of which was he led a walkout of black students, in his senior year, I think it was, or his junior year at Holy Cross, in protest against some policies that had happened. And you can see him during that walkout. They go off campus, and there's a photograph of him and a couple of others, and with the Black Power salute, he's wearing a beret, and it was part of the whole ethos. He memorized the speeches of Malcolm X, which he could still recite decades later, by listening to records. That's how people heard those things. It wasn't like a YouTube video or anything like that. And was really influenced by Malcolm X, read the autobiography, and so forth. And we could talk more about it, but it just gives you a sense that he was. And I'll just say one other thing, was that among a group of campus militants, he was especially noted, and given what subsequently happened is kind of interesting, for his militancy against interracial relationships and dating and romance. And he if he saw interracial couples on campus, he would call them out and confront them. And so among this group, he was known as fairly outspoken, confrontational kind of person.
And again, like, much of the book is dedicated to demonstrating that he's retained, even though he's moved to the right, that same sense of fatalism about race and racism in America. There are a lot of stellar and telling quotes throughout the book. But one early one that really garnered me, and I think sort of tells the story, is one from The Atlantic, I think just about 4 years actually before he was put on the court. So this isn't like a college or teenage thing. Where he says, quote, "There's nothing you can do to get past black skin. I don't care how educated you are, how good you are. You'll never have the same contacts or opportunities. You'll never be seen as equal to whites." You quote a 1985 commencement address, "I'm here to say that discrimination, racism, and bigotry have gone no place and probably never will." And in his opinions on the bench early in his tenure, he's still musing aloud that we might not ever end racial discrimination. So I have two questions about this. One is, what is race fundamentally?
I just want to pause there. Wow, that seems really out of line from what I would expect most conservative, the sort of like standard conservative position to be. Not to say that Thomas is somehow obligated to have that or anything, but that's just very surprising to hear from someone you imagine as like a real headmast, I guess, of the conservative movement.
Yeah,
it's really surprising to hear.
I think what he's got in common with a lot of other conservatives, though, is that he isn't trying to push to move past racial discrimination as one of his important things, right? And in most of their cases, it's because they believe we have gotten over the worst of it. In his case, it's because they believe we never will. But in both cases, they're kind of like negating the whether the effort to do it.
Yeah, I guess. In function, it ends up being almost identical.
Yeah.
Interesting.
For Thomas, I mean, he doesn't seem to believe in race as a matter of biological superiority or inferiority, but at the same time, he does think it's this durable, real, heritable characteristic, and one that's always going to matter, and one that isn't necessarily subject to social deconstruction. So what is race fundamentally for him? Like, is it a fully natural and tangible thing for him, or does he acknowledge that there is some amount of arbitrariness and some amount of, acculturation that goes into it?
So I think, Thomas, black nationalism has a long history, and it's a contested tradition, and it goes through very different iterations. Oftentimes, it's been a fairly conservative philosophy and ideology in this country. But in the 19th century, one of the sort of the early versions is that the black people are a people, and who have a fate and destiny apart from the rest of America. And I think for Thomas, that's kind of how he thinks about race. It's certainly not heritable or biological or anything like that, but that it is a complex product of history, tradition, culture, institutions that have sort of come together to set black people apart from the rest of America. And so I think that's what he sees. And then even more beyond that is racism, the difference between race and racism. And I think that's where you get an even more fatalistic view, because Thomas thinks that racism really has no roots. And because it sort of has no historical roots, it doesn't really have a historical ending in his mind. And, you know, he's a Catholic Christian, so you could see it as a kind of, religious sort of sensibility about the sinfulness of the soul or something like that. But in the end, I think that's the really hard part about Thomas is this sense that racism is pervasive and perdurable, and with no obvious exit ramp, with no obvious way out. And I think those would be sort of the critical ideas there.
Right. And is that, I mean, what distinguishes him fundamentally from, I guess, a mainstream black conservatism you might find in somebody like a Tim Scott or like a Ben Carson, that sense of like, you know, while some conservatives might argue that the goal is a kind of colorblind society that is attainable if you think in certain ways, what distinguishes Marx Thomas off is that he doesn't believe in that future in the way that some other black conservatives might.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important thing. And again, one of the ways he's misread both by his defenders and his critics. So for instance, on affirmative action, most white conservatives and a fair number of black conservatives will say that the wrong of affirmative action is that it violates the principle of colorblindness, of treating everybody equally and as individuals without regard to race. That's their standard line. At least it was up until Trump came along. It's changed somewhat since then. What's so mind-boggling about Thomas is that he has never accepted that argument at all. He doesn't believe in colorblindness. He says this very explicitly when he's in the Reagan administration. He says it less explicitly in his jurisprudence, but he doesn't believe in it. He doesn't think it's possible, right? We will never get past racism. And so that really does distinguish him, certainly from white conservatives, and also, as you say, from a fair number of black conservatives. And that was true back in the 80s as well. There was a roundtable convened by a magazine of black conservatives, many who have, are still around, actually, people like Glenn Loury and so forth. And, Thomas really distinguishes himself, even in that crew, in the pessimism of his view about the persistence of racism.
So I think that when most people think about black nationalism, they think about separation and independence, the idea that white people, their culture, their institutions can't really be trusted, and that black people have to make their own way in the world somehow. Part of your argument that Thomas is a black nationalist is rooted in places where you see him making the case that black people should remove themselves from politics and trying to contest white-dominated political institutions. They should try to succeed in the free market instead, which he sees as this kind of open ground. At the same time, though, like, he is a justice on the Supreme Court who was put there by predominantly white political movement. So how does he reconcile that, if at all? Like, how does he address the tension between saying, you can't really expect anything out of politics, while being one of the most powerful political figures in the country, presumably working, in his mind, to advance the interests of black people?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question and one that I wrestled with a lot in the writing. So the first thing I would say is, about his alliance with the conservative movement and the Republican Party. Um, you know, there's Malcolm X had this famous, he repeated in several speeches, this famous imagery of the wolf and the fox. And, the wolf is obviously you're a predator and your enemy. And the wolf is like the Southern racist, the Southern white racist, overt in his or her racism, doesn't pretend to be your friend, is a predator who will just go after you, and obviously. But then there's the fox who smiles and pretends that he or she is your friend and is on your side, and then will ultimately, screw you or destroy you. And
the white moderate strikes again.
Kind of, like the liberal white racist. Thomas, that imagery is very important to Thomas, and it was.
I just want to pause there. Listen, I'm white, so maybe I just don't get it. This argument is so bad. This argument is so stupid and not effective at all. Like, the only reason why, like, in the modern context, we would consider these more insidious forms of racism as more problematic, more of a problem, is because we got rid of the explicit ones. Like, I'm pretty sure if you went back in the day and, like, asked, like, literal slaves, who's worse? The person who's actively enslaving you, or, like, brutalizing you and all these horrible things, selling your children, or the person who's more insidious about it and down the line. Like, I'm pretty sure they would all say, yeah, the actual racists, the guys in the white hoods that burned down Tulsa, all these things. Like, these seem to be like the much more, like, in no other context would we ever say this. Like, it is, I think, okay and even good to acknowledge the more insidious forms in which racism can operate, because racism is bad. We want to stop racism, but like, I think very clearly the only reason why the really bad one is, or why we would consider the more insidious form to be really bad, is because we've gotten rid of the other ones.
Yeah, so let me like devil's advocate this a little bit. Like I actually mostly agree with the point you're making, but if the more subtle one is more widespread, it could be a bigger danger in aggregate. If it is harder to extirpate, that could make it in some ways as like a bigger problem. If it is harder to detect, then that could make it harder to combat, right? Does that all make sense?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I just think, the fact that racism needs to do that is evidence of the fact that we have been able to confront and defeat more explicit racism.
Yeah. I don't think you're wrong or whatever, but you know what? I wonder if this same concept, applied to a different group, probably would actually make a lot of sense. Because like when he said at the first mention of Malcolm X talking about a wolf and a fox concept, where I thought he was going with that was the idea of the like good cop bad cop dynamic, and I thought they were going to go to like the Black civil rights movement and the more aggressive side of it versus the more palatable side of it, right? Because that seems like amenable to a wolf and fox metaphor.
Well, yeah.
But I think that's like not a terribly different concept from the one that he actually did go to, where it's like there's the more aggressive side of racism and then the more palatable side of it, right? Like the concept does make sense. It's just
yeah. I wouldn't agree that I wouldn't disagree that there are more subtle forms of racism. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Something he encountered right away when he came to the North. By the way, for those of you who don't know, he was born in Pinpoint, Georgia. He spent his childhood in the South. And then he comes north. And like many African-American students who came to the North to go to college, they thought they were going to the promised land. They thought they were going to a place that was free of racism and got a rude awakening. And so for Thomas, this is where he felt like he confronted the real truth of American racism. It wasn't in the South, which he said he was familiar with, and just as an addition to that, or a corollary to that, he always felt like in the South, if you were black, whatever achievements you had and acquired, they were yours or they were the black communities. In other words, you achieved things in spite of racism. In the North, he felt like the message was almost exactly the opposite, that your achievements are not in spite of being black, but because you're black. In other words, we helped you. We, white liberal Northerners, we let you in, right? We let you come to Yale Law School. And your success is because of us. And so that's part of, for Thomas, this distinction. And so Thomas doesn't talk about the wolf and the fox. He talks about the copperhead and the water moccasin. And I'm not sure which. I think the copperhead is supposed to be like the wolf. The water moccasin's like the fox. But the crafty pretends they're not dangerous, but they are. This is a long-winded way of saying that for him, the Republican Party is an easier entity to deal with because, as he says, in the Reagan administration, nobody ever smiles at you. Nobody pretends to be your friend, and I appreciate that. By the way, his favorite song in college was, that song "Smiling Faces Tell Lies." That was the thing for him, and so I don't think there's such a contradiction for him about his relationship to the Republican Party. Now, the harder question, I'm sorry I'm being really long-winded, I just want to make sure we're set up here, is, his place on the court. It's obvious to everybody, and probably to Thomas, that, he was put on the court to, replace Thurgood Marshall. It was very important to the Republican Party to have a black person be in that seat. And there were a couple of candidates, but he was the one chosen. And he was certainly not the most illustrious jurist or scholar or anything like that. And I think that's one of those sort of psychological tensions that I think is very hard to bridge.
Can we pause for a second?
I don't know that.
I just got a really good comment and I wanted to read it. Thank you, Claire. She says, it could also be seen as a negative if the worldview is poised on racial groups being fundamentally different, whether genetically, culturally, historically, etc. It's promising a non-colorblind society when from their point of view that's impossible, therefore impeding black people as a group from realizing their potential or charting the proper course of action, since the actual dynamics at play are being obscured as opposed to open racism. I think that's a good way of putting it. You have any response? Or?
No, yeah, I think that's pretty accurate.
Okay.
So Thomas's view. I guess I don't know. The interesting thing, I should say interesting. The thing I want to be like is like, Thomas, this is just not true, right? Like, this almost presupposes like an inevitability of racism, and also discounts the difference in intensity of racism. Like, it feels like he's saying, oh, well, racism's inevitable, so I might as well deal with the worst racists. But like, well, that's really he's saying from my perspective, I guess, but I guess from his perspective, like, it feels like the racists are, all the racists are at the end of the day the same thing, right? I feel like, no, there's a really big difference between like the kind of racist who's like, getting like into a lynch mob versus like the kind of racist who like doesn't feel comfortable with like their child being in an interracial relationship. And it's really important to understand that difference, right? Because like it feels like there's it just seems obvious on the face of it that you could have a person who's extremely racist, make progress with them on making them less racist, but they're still racist, but they would be much less racist. But like, this worldview seems to preclude that possibility. The idea of like, oh, we're always going to have racism. It's like, well, are we always going to have racism of the same intensity? We'll probably never get rid of racism 100%. But does that mean we should strive to make racism less egregious, less bad, less violent? All the things that I think we have strided to do in the past. I feel like this view is fundamentally flawed.
I also would worry that a view like this is a little bit defeatist, because just making incremental progress against racism is a really good thing. It seems like Thomas's view is more like the Democrats are all subtly racist and hiding it, whereas the Republicans, when they are racist, are more out in the open about it, and so therefore I'd rather spend time with the people who who I can tell whether they're racist or not, who are like more transparent about it, and like I do like that does make sense to me. Like okay, the transparency of it matters.
Yeah, I get that. I just think he's discounting then the difference in intensity, because I would make the argument that I think historically, and even still today, the right wing in America, generally, not all, not all Republicans, generally tends to be a lot more bigoted than the left. It's not just that they're open about it, it's that their bigotry, I think, is more intense. And they have more of it.
I think that's probably true. I wonder if Clarence Thomas agrees with that or not, though. I would guess that he does, because, like, just I'm inferring that from some of the things that this guy's saying.
I would infer the opposite.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I feel like Clarence Thomas would be like, no, the only difference is the Republicans are out in the open with it, so that's why I want to deal with them. Because I feel like that's the point that, like, yes, Republicans are out in the open with it, but their racism is tangibly, independent of its transparency, is a lot more intense or a lot more or a lot bigger. I feel like that's like the silver bullet to this kind of argument. It's like the transparency is not the only thing that matters here.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I guess what I was imagining was that he would like acknowledge that the right was worse on racism, but then had the transparency to compensate for it, and then he just values the transparency more than the difference in intensity. Or maybe he disagrees about how big is the difference in intensity or something like that.
That's probably where it'd be.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine you might be right, though. Like, maybe he just thinks both sides are equally racist and one is more open about it. I don't know. It would make sense if he did believe that.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, and this gets back to what you said at the beginning, the very fatalistic view he has on racism, that there's like no historical origin, so that there's no specific end to it as well. I just had a comment, Watsku, just the dichotomy drawn is that there are no sheep. You're either a wolf that wants to kill you or a fox that wants to trick and kill you. I think that's a really good point. It feels like there's no room left in this kind of analysis for people who genuinely are not racist. It feels like Thomas Clarence believes that like racism is going to be present within everyone always, and it's just a matter of trying to manage it.
It is weird for me to hear him say that there's no historical origin of it. Also, like, I think that's just not true. I think what he means is that there might be is that racism might have a particular historic expression around it that, for example, in America it was centered around this or that, but that racism sort of that trend, the transcendent concept of racism is just part of human psychology, and it's always going to be there. There might be a historic origin to the way in which racism was expressed and translated in America, right, through chattel slavery and stuff like that. But if you get rid of that, you'll never be able to get down to the true bud of the plant of racism, the true roots, which is just human nature, I think is what he's trying to say. Oh, yeah, that would make a lot of sense. That's like a different interpretation of the statement from what I was taking, because before, like, if he said there's no historical root of racism, like, I guess you can interpret that to mean it's always been with us. Like, that would make sense. What I thought he was saying was that it just sprung up out of nowhere in America, like ex nihilo, and therefore,
I don't think he would believe that.
Yeah, because I was trying to make sense of that, and I was just like, what? That's not true. But yeah, I think
and I think that plays then into his fatalistic view on racism, which is like, you're never going to get rid of it, because it doesn't matter if we undo all the effects of slavery. If we really wiped the slate clean with slavery, or went back in time as if slavery never happened, a new form of racism would just spring up, right? You would only be getting rid of that particular expression of racism. It's fundamentally a symptom.
Yeah, which, like you said earlier, like, I think there is some truth to that, but then the degree to which it's there is very important,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
Like in-group, out-group preference does seem to be, like, a part of human psychology that's basically universal, and our tendency to just divide ourselves into cultural groups and hate the other cultures, like, there's, that's probably always going to be with us, but toning down the intensity of those conflicts is still a worthwhile thing to do.
Yeah, I think the problem is just that. I mean, it's very difficult for human beings to try and hold the idea in their head, and something we all struggle with, myself included. I'm no exception. That something can be really bad, but it can still be better than the alternatives. That's a very difficult thing. I feel like in our minds, we want a world that is very, our expectations are very much, a world that is pretty much devoid of, of moral abhorrence. But the reality is it's very difficult to try and get to that, especially when we look at specific issues. But, like, it just feels like we would not have this opinion about any other flaw in human psychology, right? For example, everyone has violent thoughts. But clearly, there's a big difference between, like, you squeezing your stress ball and imagining, like beating up your boss because you hate your boss, and like a serial killer who's like out there, every night, like bagging women and putting them in garbage bags. It's just you have to be able to acknowledge degrees of badness, and this is something that people have a really, really hard time doing. But I feel like it's like the silver bullet to this argument.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a personal story on that point, which has to do with depression, because I at one point in my young adult life, I had a really bad episode of depression, and I think one of the big things that enabled me to get on the road toward recovering from it was realizing that even if things are bad, it still helps to make them incrementally less bad, because there was like a time period where I just felt like everything sucks about my life and I just hate everything, and but just the idea that I could hate everything a little bit less would actually like set me on the road to things eventually gradually getting a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
There's much politically of significance that comes out of that, though, for Thomas. I don't think I think in the end, he feels like he is using his power that he has to essentially tell Black people to stop seeing the state as their friend, to stop looking to liberals and, these foxes and these water moccasins that are going to harm you ultimately. And I think he sees himself as a kind of, prophetic is a wrong word, but, we'll put it this way. He knows he is loathed by African Americans. He has no illusions that he is beloved by the Black community. But he also thinks that's because he's saying a very hard truth to the Black community. Many hard truths, one of which is the Democratic Party, liberalism, the American state, these are not your friends. These are your enemies, and they will destroy you. They have destroyed you. And, I'm here to, lay the path to some kind of resurrection.
So going back just a little bit, why was Thomas ultimately chosen by the movement over other options that didn't have connections to Malcolm X? And one of the things you hammer home over and over again over the course of the book is that his opinions on the bench are extraneous in the sense that you...
Oh, stand by. I think I just accidentally closed it.
You don't really need his take on the conservative position in order to win the case, right? He's always sort of injecting race, not always, but often injecting race into decisions where it doesn't have to be there. It seems like he's brought on a lot of baggage that I think that people knew. You read that there are people in the Reagan administration who understood his background as radical and were troubled by it, or at least puzzled by it. So why was that choice ultimately made?
That's a really good question. I would say two things. First of all, Thomas is an amazing political operative and operator. As it turns out, so is his wife. And everybody has always said this about him. He really knows how to work the levers. And so, he made early on an alliance with Clint Bolick, who was one of the really influential people in the first Bush administration. And that was very important. So I think that's part of it. But I think the other part about it is, and this gets back to the larger question about Black nationalism and conservatism. I talked about, there's a lot of conservative dimensions to Black nationalism. And one of them is its sympathies, not as a whole, but oftentimes it's sympathy for the market, for the economy, as a place where you could develop Black businesses. Remember, Marcus Garvey, that was a big, important part of his whole vision of Black internationalism, was of the Black shipping line and so forth. And so the market has been really important. And it was especially important, and this is something that doesn't really get enough attention, I think, among people who talk about black nationalism, but in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, there was a real experiment with black capitalism among black nationalist movements as a way of, trying to find progress for black people. It was local, and it was also national. And it was also something that the Nixon administration was, at least rhetorically, very interested in. So they used to take out, ads that that capitalism is black power, right? Capitalism is black power. And so Thomas, really believes this in his bones, like really believes in the marketplace, in capitalism and so forth. And so I think for the people for whom, he was a Supreme Court appointee, he really got the centerpiece of conservative ideology about the market and about capitalism, and could inject or inflect it with this kind of black nationalist inflection that was really part of the Republican Party. Again, rhetorically, it was never anything they were all that serious about policy-wise.
So one more on black nationalism. I mean, one other thing that makes understanding Thomas as a black nationalist complicated is that there are places you talk about in the book, especially when it comes to political rights, where he can be read as denying that black people have a coherent group interests at all. So one place where you see this is his concurrence in Holder v. Hall, which is a voting rights case, where he denies, quote, that the interests of African Americans are so distinct that they must be provided a separate body of representatives in the legislature to voice their unique point of view. So there is no, if you take that opinion seriously, there is nothing like a black interest, or at least he's arguing in that particular case. How does that square with
for a second?
The rest of his deal?
It sounds to me like that's not what he's saying. Like if his argument is that black people don't need their own separate representatives, I assume he's like talking about a gerrymandering type of case here. Like that could be interpreted to mean that you are concentrating the influence of black voters rather than spreading it out among, you know what I mean? Because like if you just try to make black only districts, one of the arguments against that is that then you take away the power of black people to be kingmakers in the other districts.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, because it seems like a really direct contradiction of the more broad worldview that sort of this lecture has been exploring. The idea that there isn't an articulable, distinct black interest.
Yeah, I would guess he thinks there is.
So this was one of his early votes.
Yeah, I'm just going to pause again. The thing I was going to say is that, before you brought up that point, which I think is actually what I actually agree with, the thing I was going to say is, I wonder if he's almost articulating this just as not as a true opinion, but as something that he thinks should be promoted as a means to an end. He does think there's an articulable black interest, but he doesn't want the state taking an interest in that, because that's only going to lead black people down a false route of, being dependent upon upon the state, which is always going to be fundamentally compromised by racism.
I wouldn't be surprised if he believes both of those things.
Mm-hmm. Voting rights case, it's like you said, it's called Holder v. Hall. It's I should say, this is the other thing about Thomas' opinions. They're extremely long. They're longer than anybody else's. They go on, sometimes for hundreds of pages. And this was one of his early opinions where he sets this out. And it's about, remember, when we're talking about voting rights, we're talking about really two aspects. One is the access to the ballot, but the other is the question about to what extent can African Americans have the sort of collective power expressed through the ballot, and this is part of the voting rights jurisprudence. And so that leads to questions about voter dilution, about cutting up districts in such a way that black people can never be a majority, and things of that sort, which we're seeing a lot of today with gerrymandering. And so Thomas, when he says that black people have no coherent interest, he actually says, and I think he uses the word political interests. It's about the political process. And I think there's two things that I think are important there for Thomas. Thomas certainly believes that black people have coherent collective interests. He talks about that all the time. What he does not believe is that there's any way possible for that interest to ever get expressed or enacted in the political process.
Yeah,
so
we
in fact,
nailed
in that you gave that quote
Rewatched.
earlier from that 1987 Atlantic Monthly interview with him, this profile of him. They said, he says there, let's say you could carve up the political world, the political sphere, and people's votes by groups. White people, Latinos, black people, and so on. Asian, I don't think he says Asian Americans, but you could imagine. He said, what would happen? Who is always going to come out on bottom? Black people. Except maybe, he says, for American Indians, right? Maybe, they would come out worse. And so I think this is this notion he has that collectively through the political process, black people can never attain any kind of real power. It's not that they don't have an interest, it's that they can't get it exercised through the political process. The other part of that, he says, is that if they were to get that, it would only be because of the majorities that white people allowed them to. So he thinks there's a kind of dependence that's created there that's very, very dangerous, and that he has a lot of issues around his, what he calls white paternalism. But he's very forthright that, black people are a numerical minority and they are a subjugated, despised people by white people. And you put those two things together, and there is no way that politically they will ever find their advance through that process.
So the book is actually divided into 3 sections. There's the first section on his racial views, which we've kind of just blitzed through very impressively in a short amount of time. But the second part of the book is headlined Capitalism, and this is where you try to develop Thomas's political economy, which intersects with race, obviously. But one of the areas where you think that a distinct worldview emerges is in his interpretations and his understanding of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, where he's adopted, from your perspective, an even more radical view than most conservatives on the bench do about its appropriate scope. Could you talk about the Commerce Clause and why it's so important to Thomas?
Sure. I mean, the Commerce Clause is important to everybody. This is, I teach constitutional law, and it's always, students get to this and they think, oh God, this sounds so boring. But it turns out, the entire American welfare state, the Civil Rights Act, these are all the Violence Against Women Act. These are all based on the Commerce Clause, which says that basically Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. 6 words. Like everything else in this country, the fate of everybody depends on 6 words in this text that was written however many hundreds of years ago. And from the very beginning, there was a debate about what that meant, and the position of the sort of nationalist position of Chief Justice, the first, not the first, but the most important Chief Justice, John Marshall, was that we should understand commerce broadly. And there was this understanding of commerce in the 18th century, and I'm sorry this is going to sound a little academic and wonky, but it's important for the Thomas stuff, that commerce is that commerce is a form of contact between different types of people, right? Marshall says in the decision, he says, commerce is intercourse, which is a very common way that it was talked about in the 18th century. Samuel Johnson, in his dictionary, says commerce is the interchange of anything. So that it wasn't just about the exchange of goods, but it was about the exchange between very distant people who were very different from each other. And it was a way of bringing different people together. It was this kind of, grand multicultural vision. And so the Commerce Clause was always thought by a certain kind of progressive nationalist in this country to be a way of unifying the country, of bringing the North and the South not just together economically, but culturally, socially. And so that, and from that in the 20th century, you get this idea that because Congress has the right to regulate the economy or commerce, which becomes to be the economy, it ultimately has the right to pass the Civil Rights Act. Now, how does that make any sense? Well, if you think about it, and this is in the testimony around the Civil Rights Act, black people can't travel very easily from the South to the North. And Thomas, in fact, talks about this in his testimony when he's before the Senate. He talks about how when his family had to travel, like many black people in the South, they had to pack everything, all the food they were going to need in the trunk because you couldn't be assured that there was a restaurant that you could stop at. You would sleep in the car. There was, in fact, a little green book that was a guide for black people to where you could go. So that segregation, in other words, inhibits commerce. Right. And, there was all kinds of testimony cases that, so segregated restaurants inhibited commerce, segregated schools, and so on and so forth. So the Commerce Clause is really at the center of the New Deal and of the Civil Rights Act. Thomas hates it. Absolutely hates it. I mean, most conservatives have hated this broad interpretation of commerce because they rightly understand the way it has been expanded. And there was
For those who don't know, the original ruling on the Commerce Clause is a really interesting case because it establishes that there's almost basically no limit, at least in my opinion. The original ruling, I think, of the Commerce Clause, it was about a farmer who was growing a kind of wheat that I believe was not allowed to be sold. There's a certain kind of wheat not allowed to be sold, but he's growing it privately and feeding it to his own cows. He's not selling it. And basically what the Commerce Clause says is that, and the government tries to say, okay, you know what, you're not allowed to grow it either. You're not allowed to do this, even though you're only growing it for your own animals and feed it to your animals, and you're not selling it, you're not allowed to do this. And the court basically rules, well, the government does have the authority to do this because the act of simply growing this special kind of wheat and not, even though you're not selling it, because you're growing it, you're not buying the other kinds of wheat, which does affect interstate commerce because you could be buying that other kind of wheat across state lines, which means the government does have the authority to come in and say you can't do that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's... I remember when we were talking about that, like last year, that came up in one of the debates, like Lactoid and Pisco were talking about that. I think it's a pretty insane interpretation of what commerce means because, like, at that point, like, if the ability to regulate commerce means that you can regulate anything that affects commerce, like, there's just no limit to that. Like, almost literally, like, almost anything that happens in the world potentially affects interstate commerce, right? So... it's like, what can't
Wickard
you...
versus Filburn, that's the case.
Yeah, so, like, what can't you justify with this, right? So I'm definitely sympathetic to the idea that this is a very troubling interpretation of that clause. And it's strange to me that they couldn't find something else to help them justify, like, the Civil Rights Act for like okay, applying this to, like, the New Deal actually makes a lot of sense because it's like a big economic program. Like, of course that's commerce, right? I mean, it's commerce not just in the way they thought about it in the 1800s, but it's commerce today. Like, it's just uncontroversial that that's going to heavily affect commerce, and that it is primarily directed at commerce. But something like the Civil Rights Act, I mean, it's just strange to me that they well, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they had more justifications for it than just the Commerce Clause. So maybe I shouldn't. Maybe this point is dumb.
Yeah, but anyways, that's just the context of the Commerce Clause for those who don't know.
Big case, some of you may remember, the Lopez decision in 1995, which was about guns in schools. Congress had passed a bill saying that you couldn't have have a gun on you, possess a gun, within 1,000 feet of a school zone. Why? Well, according to the Commerce Clause, if there's violence in schools, that means students aren't going to learn. If they're not going to learn, that's going to affect the economic health and well-being of the country. This is the way the jurisprudence goes. So conservatives, Rehnquist strikes it down, but Thomas does another one of his concurrences. And he thinks Rehnquist and Scalia don't go far enough. And he comes up with a definition of commerce that basically would according to many scholars, and I think they're right, would overturn Chief Justice John Marshall's original precedent in Gibbons versus Ogden. So going back to a view of commerce that is older than I think that case was 1826. Now, for many years, people thought, Thomas is just insane. He's just crazy, and he's been hostage to these ultra right wingers, and nobody paid attention to him. I think after the Dobbs decision that we just had in the spring, where he again has one of his concurrences, much shorter, but he tells you where he's going with this, and people aren't just dismissing it anymore. And likewise with this Commerce Clause decision. I mean, I don't like to do the Supreme Court, where is it going, where is it heading thing, because I get those predictions wrong all the time. However, it's certainly not the case anymore that he's a lone voice on these types of questions. And so you overturn that Commerce Clause, you're overturning the Civil Rights Act, you're overturning the Wagner Act, which is how we have labor unions in this country, and it's a lot of stuff that goes with it.
And this is also the section in the book where you talk about some of the recent, decisions and sort of debate over political speech, money is speech, corporations and their influence on politics and campaigns and elections. You say here that, as with every other issue, race is in the background for Thomas. But oddly enough, when it comes to his opinions and turns on the campaign finance and commercial speech front, he doesn't inject race as readily as he does in other issue areas. Do you have a sense of why that might be?
I don't. And this was a big, I didn't have to dig very deep with most of those opinions. The races pervades there. And again, the puzzle to me was, why haven't people seen them? There's obviously, things like affirmative action, but, in these other cases about like the Commerce Clause and so forth, it's everywhere. With commercial speech, with campaign finance, everybody knows what that's about. Commercial speech is this, just so people know, is the kind of cutting edge of where the conservatives are really going. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech for most of the history of this country. That was perceived to be primarily about political speech. Starting in about the 1970s, conservatives became interested in what they called commercial speech, first and foremost, advertising. Most First Amendment people thought commercial advertising, that's not political speech. It has nothing to do with speech. Why would we? It doesn't deserve protection. Conservatives said that's not true. Again, Thomas is now at the forefront of expanding this. And this is something that is really important for people to pay attention to, because as Justice Kagan said in one of her dissents in the last couple of years, conservatives have weaponized the First Amendment, right? Speech is part of the entire economy. If, when you fire somebody, you engage in an act of speech. If that becomes a protected act of First Amendment speech, you can't really regulate the hiring and firing of people the way that we currently do. So
the other thing I think is really hairy about the nature of speech versus political speech and what can and can't be protected by the First Amendment is I feel like there is a very strong argument that as soon as you try to start to ban and regulate something, that the expression of that thing is a form of political speech in and of itself. I'm reminded of the case, oh God, I'm not going to remember the name, but there was a very famous case where these kids were wearing these peace armbands. During the time of Vietnam, there were these kids at public school who were wearing these armbands promoting peace in in Vietnam. And the school said, oh, you can't do this. There was a huge case, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically ruled, you know what, this is a form of speech. Wearing this clothing is a form of speech. And it established the significant disruption test for speech in schools. Basically, if the school wants to restrict the speech of their students while they're at school, that speech must represent a significant disruption of the education process. I think there's a lot of truth to the idea that, you know, if you like for example, obscenity laws, right? This is like a classic one that people fight about is, you know, should there be obscenity laws? And I think there's a very strong case to be made that in a context where obscenity laws are passed and there's a crackdown, that engaging in speech that is obscene in violation of these laws is a form of political demonstration, a form of political speech. So I don't know how you can ever, you know, with I think the maximalist nature of the First Amendment, I don't know how you can ever come down on restrictions for these kinds of things.
Yeah.
This is very important, and Thomas is at the forefront. It is a puzzle, however, as you say, even though he gives you hints and clues around the edges, race doesn't primarily come into it. But I won't get into the specifics, but there's a very influential speech he gave where I think he sets out the connections between race and these ideas about commercial speech and the First Amendment. But you're right, it's definitely not in the jurisprudence.
So as we've already kind of talked about, I mean, he thinks that politics is a dead end, or at least politics as we know it is a kind of dead end for minorities, black people. He'd much rather have black people try to start their own businesses, try to compete in the free market, develop themselves that way, develop wealth that way. So, you know, I mean, in this particular section, and it relates to the campaign finance stuff too, you write that the, quote, the thrust of Thomas's opinions is to authorize men of means to dominate the political realm. So taking those two thoughts together, do you think that his opinions in this area are aimed at kind of rationalizing the, you know, how little power minorities have in the political system, or is he actively trying to force minorities out of the political system because he thinks politics is bad for them and they're better off doing something else? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's both. I mean, but with the emphasis on the second. In other words, you know, he really, and you can't stress this enough. Like, people say, oh, you know, how could Thomas, he's contradictory. He's against voting rights for black people. And for Thomas, you know, it's like, duh, of course he's against voting rights for black people. He doesn't believe, he thinks it's a fool's errand, and he really wants black people to stop participating in the political process. Like, he really doesn't believe.
These goddamn activist judges, legislating from the bench. That feels like a really, assuming this is a correct descriptive analysis, which it may not be, that seems really damning. The idea that, like, you want to affect an outcome. And instead of saying, oh, I want to affect this outcome and promoting it, you endorse rulings that are based on certain legal, certain logic of the law, certain interpretation and understanding of the law that you don't actually agree with, but just because you think that interpretation will allow you to justify a ruling which will have a certain effect to get you to your desired outcome. That seems really that seems like the probably one of the worst things you could do as a Supreme Court justice.
Well, it's certainly if you're endorsing decisions that you don't actually agree with, then yeah, that would be like just about the worst. I think there's like a softer way that this can be done, where you endorse ones that you do agree with, but you do so very selectively, right? Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
You decide which cases to hear based on which ones you think will have advantageous outcomes, that kind of thing.
Yeah, okay.
And that's still bad, but less bad, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree.
There is anything to be gained and certainly a lot to be lost from that. He does believe, however, that the economy and the market is a place where black people can't progress. I don't think he really believes in progress, but can survive, can carve out niches for themselves. And there's an autobiographical dimension to this. He was raised by his grandfather, Myers Anderson, who was we would say today, a black entrepreneur. He started off by selling fuel, I think ice actually, blocks of ice, and then became a fuel delivery company to black people who were not being served by the existing economy or the government. And for Thomas, this is this kind of I don't know what you'd call it. This sort of this story he comes back to constantly. And the story is, my grandfather did this under the worst conditions of Jim Crow. The worst conditions of Jim Crow. And he created not just a successful business for himself and his family, but an extended network for the Black community in Savannah, Georgia. And that really is at the heart of his vision. And it's two things. One, again, is these sort of niche areas. And I should say, like the Nixon administration used to do this all the time. They talk about Black hairdressers and the importance of Black hairdressers for as independent businesswomen for the Black economy. But so for Thomas, it's these niches that are not being served by the rest of the economy, but that a kind of enterprising Black person can provide for and develop, and that they're communal spaces, and that these and that it is, and this is the critical thing for Thomas, something we haven't really talked about that much. It's the center of Black men, right? That this is a space for Black men to thrive, who, he has said forthrightly, the salvation of the Black community depends upon Black men. This is a very patriarchal vision, but it's very much tied to his vision of Black capitalism.
Right. And so you develop this in the third and final section of the book, which is headlined Constitution. I guess the central argument here, the central framing, is that Thomas really sees two constitutions. There's a Black constitution and there's a white constitution. Both of them have distinct roles, as you say, in sort of shaping Black men in particular. Here's a quote here. So the purpose of Thomas's Black constitution, you write, is to support the Black patriarch where it exists. The purpose of Thomas's white constitution is to create the patriarch where he does not exist. So you could talk about what you mean by that and what these two constitutions actually mean and say.
So Thomas, is a self-described originalist. You've probably heard that term, originalism. Most white conservative originalists really believe that, the Constitution is what the men in 1787 wrote, and that's the Constitution. What distinguishes Thomas's originalism is that he accepts a lot of the historiography of liberals that says the Constitution was fundamentally transformed through the experience of emancipation and Reconstruction and Civil War. That there's a second Constitution, a new founding, that is transforms not just through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and the incorporation of Black people, it transforms the entire American state. And makes the national state the center and the foundation for the protection of rights everywhere, and that this is a new transformation. And Thomas accepts that, but with a twist. So for liberals, this means the 13th, 14th Amendment means the federal government can protect individuals against state discrimination. It can protect freedom of speech. It could, transform the economy and all of these other kinds of things. For Thomas, the centerpiece of that Black Constitution, the right that was nationalized through the 14th Amendment, the fundamental right of citizens that was nationalized through the 14th Amendment, is the right to bear arms. And if you read his opinion on this, it is both chilling and fascinating. Because at the center of the right to bear arms is the Black patriarch. It's the Black man protecting his family against the Klan, against white terrorism with a gun, right? And that is the figure of salvation. And so for Thomas, the Black Constitution protects the Black man, the Black patriarch, where he is, wherever he may be found. That strong figure, like his grandfather, this impressive sort of will to power, who defies everybody and protects his family and advances the interests of his community. But Thomas believes the problem of 20th century liberalism is that it corroded that figure. It destroyed that figure by giving rights, welfare rights, criminal justice rights, sexual liberties, and sexual freedom. And because of what is called the rights revolution, the New Deal, the Great Society, the sexual revolution, black men, the position of black men in the black community has been corroded. And this is the, I don't like to get into psychobiography too much. I feel like people love to do that with Thomas, and I don't like it. But it's hard to ignore the autobiographical elements there, because his father, not his grandfather, his father left him. He hardly ever saw his father. And his father is the figure he's talking about there. Had left his family, had multiple lovers, goes to the north, enjoys the freedom of movement that's suddenly available to black people after the war, and so on. So that absent black patriarch is what has destroyed the black community. How do we get that black patriarch back? How did he exist in the first place? And this, I think, is sort of ground zero of the truly, truly scary part of Thomas's vision. Because anyway, I think it's obvious why it's so scary. How did we get that black patriarchal figure? We got him under Jim Crow and under slavery. In other words, it was the most nightmarish, dystopian moments of American history that produced this kind of figure of salvation who did this achievement of protecting the black community and enabling it to survive against all the odds. And now that he is gone, the only way to recreate him is by creating the kind of conditions of punishment and difficulty and constraint and sometimes he'll say this, that kind of recreate the virtues of black masculinity under Jim Crow. And hence you get these terrifying opinions about prisons and about police, where it's almost as if he's saying the more punitive and the more racist, the better. Because the American experience, the American story has taught us that those are the conditions in which these heroic figures of redemption, like my grandfather, I'm speaking in Thomas's voice, right, came about. And that we, as the black community, will never get back on its feet until we restore those figures. And that's really the project of American constitutionalism and American originalism.
You want to pause for a second?
Is to restore the kind of conditions that created those figures.
Okay, that seems insane.
That's the same thing I was going to say, yeah.
That seems insane. So we need to make things worse and more racist, so that way people like this is just like accelerationism. This is like like he's just providing accelerationism. Which, by the way, bro, we need to. We are currently in a malaise because the conditions aren't that bad. So we need to make them bad like they used to be, because that will then get But wait. We already know what happens when you get to those really bad conditions. You get to where we are right now. What? Like, I guess the idea is that it would be so bad that this time, when we defeat racism, instead of getting to the midpoint where we are now and we get stuck, we go all the way. Like, you don't have any evidence for that. Like you're just saying that. Like, what evidence do you have to make you think that would be the case? Like, that's just something that sounds nice, that seems to make intuitive sense. You have no idea if that would actually happen.
I really wonder how much is this stuff that Clarence Thomas has explicitly said versus how much is this like this guy's analysis where he's reading into Clarence Thomas, right? Because this sounds like an almost implausibly crazy thing to believe. And it sounds like, can you imagine, like, he's doing his hearings in the Senate and they're deciding whether to put him on the Supreme Court and he's saying all this stuff and then a bunch of Republicans vote for him. It's boggles the mind, but like I find it hard to believe, honestly.
Yeah, I guess the interesting thing would be are there any responses or takedowns of this guy's book on Clarence Thomas? That'd be the interesting thing to see.
Yeah.
So the way you put it in the book is, quote, "The white constitution makes black freedom possible through the instruments of policing, punishment, and prison. With the help of these instruments, black people, particularly black men, are restored to a world of harsh consequences from which they can learn the virtues of responsibility." And it is a very jarring argument. But when I read it, I sort of recognized something
Chatter says,
a little bit familiar.
It's
in
the
it.
hard times, good men meme.
Yeah, literally.
In that there seems to be something similar in the notion in mainstream respectability politics of being twice as good, right? So you ought to be pushed by racism into being better than anybody else. You ought to be pushed by these conditions to strive. But the difference there, though, is that I think in mainstream respectability politics, being twice as good is a burden that's going to be shoved off with time. Once society improves to a certain point, you won't have to have that added sense of responsibility. With Thomas, I think what you're saying is that he thinks that being twice as good is an aspiration that's just sort of worth keeping around for its own sake. Like we should always want to be twice as good, forever and ever. Amen. Does that seem like the right way to think about it?
Absolutely. I mean, there's two aspects to this. One is a kind of pessimism saying that you're always going to have to be twice as good. It's just that's the way it's always going to be, and you could hope till the cows come home, but be clear, that's not going to change. But there's an extra, as always with Thomas, there's a little bit extra, which is that, and where this comes from, you could say it comes from his Catholicism, there's all kinds of things, but there's a real belief that adversity breeds strength. It creates for strength, that when things become too easy, people get complacent. They get lazy. And I mean, I should say, it's like, this was, I was recently kind of going through some of this stuff again. In the 70s, this was a kind of bipartisan belief, was that, America was suffering from too many rights. And the problem with that wasn't that it was creating anarchy or disorder. It was that it was creating softness. Right?
Yeah, literally
when
is.
Things, entitlements and all that kind of stuff. That you got to make things harder for people a little. I mean, that's at the heart of welfare reform, which under Bill Clinton, you've got to make things harder for people in order to elicit the kind of virtues that we prize. Courage.
I thought it was really interesting for him to bring up the Catholicism angle, right? Because I wouldn't have immediately made that connection, but it does make a lot of sense when you think about other famous Catholic public figures. It's like the Mother Teresa attitude, right? It's like the idea that that humanity benefits from punishment, deserves punishment, and this is our place in the world is to become better people by having to rise above oppression.
Yeah, I think you just hit the nail on the head earlier. It is literally the meme of strong times or good times create weak men create hard times create strong men create good times. It feels like he is literally just fully, or at least this opinion that is being presented as an analysis of him seems like it is literally just that meme.
Yeah. I mean, the one big difference is that meme is supposed to represent this cyclical view of history where we oscillate back and forth between the hard times and the good times or whatever. But it seems like okay. If Clarence Thomas really believes this, then it seems like he just wants us to permanently be in the hard times so that we have the strong men. And
that's the thing I always wonder. Is if you endorse this view of the cycle, it seems like you are literally just endorsing what would not be a standard right-wing position, but would be more of a left-wing of determinism, free will doesn't really matter, we're all trapped in the effects of this larger institution. The ways in which they talk about we're subject to this cycle isn't that different from the ways in which, for example, more left-leaning people would say, we're subject to these institutions of systemic racism. It's funny, Thomas says these people, they view themselves as, or rather this guy believes that Thomas would say, you people say you people just become dependent upon the state. You're just subject to it, and that prevents you from doing anything yourself. But then you could just say the exact same thing to Thomas. You would feel like you are just dependent upon this cycle, that it is inevitable, and in that same way, you are just as sort of trapped and encapsulated within a larger thing. It's just in the different cycle.
Yeah, I mean, but it kind of sounds like his position is a response to that cycle rather than like a surrender to it, though, right? Because it seems like he's saying, rather than cycling back and forth and between times that create strong men versus times that don't, we should break the cycle by having the strong men, like the strong men should know better than to create easy times, right? They should.
Yeah, I guess that's the question. Does Thomas believe that we're trapped in the cycle forever, or that you can truly get to the point where you get to the hard times, you create the good times, but don't then have the sort of repeat of that cycle into the weak times?
Yeah, or you just don't want the good times because you think the strong men are more important than the good times.
Yeah.
Grit. I mean, grit, that word grit is, when my kid was in elementary school, everybody was talking about grit. They don't talk about that anymore. But, persistence, all of these virtues, and that when the conditions of society are such that things are too easy, you get slackers. So, again, Thomas takes this, really far, but I think he speaks, for more than himself when he says that kind of stuff.
So we should talk at least a little bit here about Thomas on abortion. Obviously this came out well before the Dobbs decision and his concurrence. You do suggest in the book, when you talk about abortion, that it seems to be a place where he is a little bit more in line with the rest of the conservative justices. At the same time, though, like if you read his concurrence in Box v. Planned Parenthood, maybe in other places too, he does make these references to eugenics and to racial eugenics and discrimination when thinking through abortion. Can you give us a broad sense about how he thinks about abortion and also the extent to which the Dobbs concurrence from just a little while back is significant?
Yeah, so, if there were a part of the book I'd revised, it would be about abortion. When I wrote the book, it was published in 2019. Thomas's opinions about abortion seem mostly pretty boilerplate. There was a little bit of misogyny in his citations. So, for instance, he referenced the dissenting opinion in Roe v. Wade, which was actually written by a Democratic appointee, which basically acted like, women were getting abortions because they were irresponsible and wanted to have sex without consequences. So there was kind of misogyny in his decisions, but there was nothing there. And then after the book came out, he wrote, as you said, this opinion 2 years ago, where he sets out a vision of birth control and abortion as a project of white eugenics, ethnic sort of purification. Now, there's a long history of that argument about Margaret Sanger and her racism. It's not a completely out of left field sort of a thing. And Thomas, as is his wont in his decision, he quotes the NAACP in Harlem in 1968, saying that birth control clinics are a way of controlling the black community and the black population and all the rest of it. But he gives a real racial inflection to what abortion is about. And again, he writes this decision. It's a solo not decision, an opinion, a solo opinion. Nobody pays that much. Well, I guess people paid some attention. But what's truly shocking is that in the Dobbs decision, which Alito wrote, the recent one, there's a footnote. And there Alito talks about the connections between abortion, birth control, and eugenics. So as always with these things, Thomas is planting these seeds that then get picked up by lower court justices and now Alito. And so it's what role that's going to play, I don't know, but it's telling that it's popping up in more than one place.
So I think one more question before we'll turn it over to the audience. Unfortunately, we can't tell people to go to the polls in November and vote out Clarence Thomas from the Supreme Court. So what do you think is the kind of practical upshot to all of this? One thing that I thought about reading this book, obviously, again, it came out a couple of years ago, is that we saw in 2020 at the polls a bit of erosion amongst some minority groups, especially Hispanics, in their support for the Democratic Party. Republicans have invested very heavily into building outreach to the Black community. It hasn't paid off quite yet, but they're making real efforts. One of the things this book, I think, really illustrates is that there are a lot of different paths to the political right, even if you're a minority. And you can't really expect a kind of demographic essentialism to draw people to liberal politics and to the politics of racial justice. So I don't know, do you think that the book offers practical political lessons in that sense about how we should think about race and conventional politics now?
Yeah, I mean, Trump in a way, scrambled a lot of different things, but people forget, under George W. Bush, there was, I think Latinos were voting by 2004 for Bush, 38% or something like that. It was a pretty high number. And that was a big project of Bush's compassionate conservatism. It was a big thing. Bush spoke Spanish. I mean, he probably spoke 10 words. But, it was a big selling point in building a kind of multicultural conservatism. And then it kind of got shut down, starting with Romney in 2012 and then obviously with Trump. But in 2020, we saw the beginnings of a revival around it. And
it reminds me, I believe it was in 2004, George H.W. Bush got, I think, 44% of the Hispanic vote in the presidential election. Very close to an outright majority.
I do think that this is something that liberals and Democrats really need to grapple with, is just this notion that, as the country becomes more multicultural and more immigrants and more multiracial, that somehow it means automatically people heading toward the path to liberalism. And I think that's just, factually wrong. But I think the other part of this book is that there's a kind of fatalism about race and pessimism that we've talked about that, my editor wouldn't let me put this in, but I really wanted to put this in. I'll just never forget that Hillary Clinton speech in Nevada in 2016 during the primaries, where she said, if we, break up the banks, is that going to end racism? If we do X, and it was an argument against Sanders, sort of class-first politics. But if you listened to it carefully and watched it, I mean, it was really just saying we're never going to end racism. And anybody who tells you otherwise is foolish. And
oh,
I
God,
disagree
why
with
would
him.
you say that? Why would you say that? Oh,
Yeah.
God, it's so stupid.
I don't think that's
my
what Hillary was saying. I think she was saying we can make progress against racism, but focusing purely on economics could come at the expense of that focus.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the question is, can you take tangible steps to significantly reduce racism or to significantly reduce its effects or to significantly improve the outcomes of people that are subject to racism? And the answer is obviously yes. Obviously yes. Sorry, I'm going to have to start invoking my 2014 Ben Shapiro compilation knowledge here. But could you please look at would you honestly say America is more racist now than it was in the 1960s? Could you honestly say it's more racist now than it was, when the KKK was going around, still trying to lynch people? Obviously fucking not. Okay, that's the actual answer. If you say otherwise, you're delusional. So clearly there can be tangible steps taken to improve the situation. So what the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah, and I don't think Hillary Clinton would disagree with you either. I'm pretty sure she...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, what Hillary Clinton is obviously talking about is that there is a really big trend of sometimes on the Bernie Sanders type-esque part of the left of reducing everything to class struggle and of not acknowledging sometimes the unique challenges faced by black people, saying that, for example, oh, racism, that's just capitalism, right? That might sound sexy if you're of a certain political persuasion, but really what it does is to, I think, undermine the very unique and specific kind of discrimination that black people have faced. Personally, I think that intersectionality is the obvious answer, which, by the way, God, I hate that, intersectional feminism. That's like a thing. You have intersectionality ascribed to you, and it just sounds like 2 + 2 = 4. Like, what's intersectionality? Oh, intersectionality, what we do is when we analyze a situation, instead of taking into account one factor, we take into account all the factors. That's an ideology? That you don't just do that? What? Are there ideology out here that's like, we only take into account one factor and one factor only? Like, that just seems like the thing you should do if you want to try to come to the best descriptive analysis. Like, holy shit.
But the fact that Hillary Clinton needs to point that out to people who want to reduce everything to class means that apparently it is not just common sense.
Yeah, it's just, what the fuck ever, dude. Just nuke the goddamn planet. I mean, Jesus Christ. Whatever, bro. Anyways, yeah. What were we paused originally to say, yes, you can actually make steps on the path of racism, right? Like, it's just like, no one, it's just everything's the same thing. Everything is the same argument. There are levels of badness. So when you say we'll never get rid of racism, what you're thinking is, oh, we'll never be able to improve racism. Or, sorry, not improve racism. We'll never be able to improve upon the fact that, upon the negative outcomes that racism has. We'll never be able to make racism less bad. But we can. I personally think you'll never get rid of racism 100%. But you can get rid of it like 95%, okay? And like, for example, at certain points of history, when we got rid of it like 5%, right? Like, for example, when we had slavery, right? When slavery was a massive thing practiced by virtually every human civilization on the face of the earth, and now it's practiced by much less. And there's some civilizations where it's practiced by where it's not practiced at all. And the civilizations where it still is practiced, it's practiced not quite as badly, and we can still get it better. But like, it's just obvious. It's just obvious. That's like the whole point. That's like the whole point. So I have nothing else to say. I don't know why this is so hard for people. I don't know.
I do think, Lonnie Guinier had this great argument about how African Americans are often the canary in the coal mine. What happens to African Americans first, then happens to other people, afterwards. And I think the sort of racism talk of Thomas is something that's worth paying attention to, because that sense of the irreducibility, the unchangeability, the persistence, and that politics can't do anything about it, I don't think is just true of Clarence Thomas. And I think that's something to reckon with.
That's actually really true, just in terms of people believing that. It's not true, but I do think there is a real sense among people that there is a sort of futility to politics. I think this really, honestly, God, I think we're all just living in like it's like, like the phantom limb syndrome, like long after something is dead, you still feel its pain. I think we're all living under the shadow of like the Phantom World Trade Center, where like 9/11 and the events that followed, Iraq, Afghanistan, and then you throw in 2008, 2009 financial crisis. I think this is like not permanently, it is for significant period of time, and we're going to be in it for a bit, has poisoned our culture towards a certain thing where like there's some certain fundamental assumptions that it feels like almost every political movement has, particularly ones that are more popular among younger people. As you get younger, it's more and more true of like the government is fundamentally like corrupt. Pick your choice as to what corruption that is. If you're on the extreme right, maybe it's the Jews. If you're on the extreme left, maybe it's also the Jews. If you're in the middle, it's probably corporations or lobbyists or the deep state or whatever. It's why I think that a lot of the modern right is so fundamentally opposed to what the traditional right has always had, because I think the new right is like fundamentally a kind of like, this doesn't make any literal sense in terms of the use of the terms literally, but I think like the populist right is fundamentally like almost a left-wing thing, where they're talking about like, these big evil institutional powers are arranged against us and we the people must rise up. I mean, this really gets into an argument about what is left and what is right, and personally I just think you ditch those terms and you just say, I think that it is fundamentally rooted in this kind of thought that we would traditionally more think of as left-wing, but not to say it's inherently left-wing. And I think that has had a horrible, horrible effect. I mean, I think like the failures, in a way, I think the failures of the right wing, and also our institution, I don't want to fully blame the right wing, in the in the 2000s, right, 2010, have really permanently biased a lot of people, particularly young people, against what that traditional right wing archetype represented, which is, our institutions, incremental reform, markets, capitalism. I don't think it's a surprise that even on the right, you see a lot of people now not talking necessarily about so much about capitalism. Ron DeSantis going after Florida. Corporations that have gotten woke. That whole idea of we need to boycott corporations. A very big distinction from the traditional neocons of like Bush and Reagan.
On the racism point, I think I would be much more sympathetic to just like a softer version of this, like where if somebody is pessimistic about how much progress we can make, against racism, that they believe that there's a lot of resistance against attempts to improve on it, or maybe if they think that politics isn't the best venue for it, and that we would need to change the culture first in order to make the political changes stick. I think that I'd be like much more sympathetic to that, but to say that like politics can do absolutely nothing about racism, it just seems like insane.
Sorry, just typing something in my chat there. It's just like the correct position is super easy. It's super easy. It's like, wow, racism is really bad, and you know what? Progress isn't always, possible in the extremes, right? You can't always have dynamic leaps forward, but you can make progress. It's also like humans are so biased, dude, because like we look at history and we see all these great paradigmatic, huge changes we had in like the 60s with the civil rights movement. And first off, that's a bit of rose-tinted glasses. Like there was very much a 2 steps forward, 1 step back, even during the time of the civil rights era. But it's also just true, like, man, sometimes we don't have problems that are as clear and easy to fix. It's funny we say that now. Let me just finish that. We always have problems as clear, as easy to fix as slavery, right? And even me saying that's funny. If people during the time of getting rid of slavery heard me say that, they'd be like, "Bro, getting rid of slavery was not clear or easy." But it's like, bro, compared to our problems now, it is so much clearer and so much easier. Like you know, people, hey guys.
Yes, I'm not sure about easier, but
Well, I think it's a big part of it. I mean, I guess it's fundamentally a different kind of difficulty. The problem is that the racism that we are most able to get rid of, we've gotten rid of, because that would be the first thing you do. The only problems left in regards to racism are the really, really hard ones, the really, really difficult ones, the ones where it's like, okay, guys, we need to talk about the fact that even though you don't hate black people and you don't feel any sort of real bias towards them, you might still have some sort of unconscious bias, and when you play that out over large scale things, even though there's no one that's actually explicitly racist, you can still have disparate outcomes in policing. And it's like, people are like, but I'm not racist, bro. But I'm not racist. Like, I know you're not racist. I'm not trying to say that. But like, these problems are so much harder to get people to agree on and get movement on. So it's just like, of course, if you wanted to tackle racism, would you tackle the parts of racism that are easy to tackle or that are hard to tackle? Of course you're gonna choose the ones that are easy to tackle. Like, duh. Oh, that's obvious. That's just so obvious. But like people just have no perspective for this, and it's like I don't exactly blame them, right? Like me saying that to like a person who isn't getting significant gains in regards to their experience with racism, that doesn't help them, right? If there's a person who experiences this kind of racism, this new kind of more insidious and difficult to eradicate racism in the 2000s, and then we get to the 2020s where we're at now and we haven't made significant progress, me telling them, oh well, it's actually really hard because this kind of progress is fundamentally different from the kind of progress we made previously. So even though we're making less gains, we're actually making even though we're making less literal gains, that doesn't mean we're making less progress, because this kind of progress is harder even though it has less gains. Like that doesn't do anything for them, but also it's like it's fundamentally true. Like I don't know, people are foolish, everyone is foolish. I'm no exception, and I don't know. GG. Sorry, hold on, I got someone in chat. Just as a premise thought from what I hear a lot, do you think most of the separation between people's outcomes are based on oppression or racial factors versus things like culture? If a mix, what percentages of all of these? I mean, it's definitely a mix. The problem is, like, it's really hard to, like, exactly draw the lines of where, like, explicit racism begins and cultural impact ends. Like, for example, something that is not, does not have positive effects on the black community is their relationship with the police. But it's also kind of hard to be like, guys, the reason why black people have bad outcomes isn't because of racism, it's because of the culture they have with the police. Where did that culture with the police come from? Well, if you go back to the 60s, there was a lot of explicit racism which created that culture. It's a really hard thing. I think it's definitely both. No doubt there's some cultural factors, some racism factors, and there's a confluence between them. I couldn't tell you what the percentage is. The reality is you just have to focus on tangible outcomes. Regardless of what we think that percentage is, we need to find tangible things that we can work on, and we need to work on those things. And that's like the fundamental thing that we need to get at. I don't know if I could ever come to a conclusion about the percentages.
All right, I think this is the point where all of you will get a chance to ask some questions, and somebody will be coming around with the microphone.
Why doesn't he practice what he preaches in terms of interracial relationships?
This is a good question. It comes up a lot. The truth is, I don't really know. I mean, ultimately, I don't know the answer to that question. I will say that all the evidence that we have is that he believed what he believed in about interracial romance until the moment that he didn't. And that's really the best. I mean, I try to make sense of him to the best that I can, and there are a lot of contradictions that I think I do make sense of. And then there's just, I will say one thing, though, is that, well, no, I won't. No, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Saved.
He's allowed to change his mind. It's okay.
I don't want to get myself into trouble.
I had the pleasure to listen to Obama today. They unveiled his the portraits. I'm wondering the impact of the Obama presidency and how that, intersected with his thinking.
I'm really glad you
Yeah.
asked that question because it, again, gets to one of these really difficult areas of Thomas's belief system. In his autobiography, which Thomas has a memoir, My Grandfather's Son, he says that, his first real encounter with the color line, he was born in Pinpoint, and then when he's 5 or 6, he moved to Savannah, was in Savannah. In Pinpoint, it was all black community. And he moves to Savannah, and his first encounter, he says, is not from white people. It's from other black people who are lighter skinned than he is. Thomas is dark skinned, and he was called ABC, America's Blackest Child. He was made fun of for his hair was, it was an ongoing theme, the kind of way that he was looked down upon. And for Thomas, as and this is again a kind of a difficult discourse within the black community, it's, colorism. Thomas associated light-skinned black people with wealthier, more professional, and then ultimately with liberals. So remember Drew Days, who was Bill Clinton's Solicitor General, or going back even further, Patricia Harris, who was Jimmy Carter's secretary, what would be now HUD, HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare. These black liberal figures, big, icons in the black community, very light-skinned, and Thomas was not shy about making that connection. This is a long way of saying, so what did Barack Obama represent to him? I think it was that kind of, lighter-skinned, black manager, we call it professional managerial class, of which Thomas is, of course, a part of himself. But I think that's the way he sees the Obama administration. These are the kind of liberal black people who looked down upon him in the schoolyard, and whom he has been fighting with ever since.
Hey, question right here.
Where?
Right here. Are there any issues in which he crosses over and votes with the liberal justices? And if so, how does that one issue or issues fit into his kind of overarching philosophy on race and politics and the rest?
Yeah, I mean, on certain criminal justice issues, interestingly enough, this gets into some very technical stuff in criminal justice jurisprudence, but on issues like sentencing, where more years were added beyond by a judge, or more discretion was given to sentencing, he will often side with liberal justices. Why he does that is complicated, and I talk about it in the book. I don't know how interesting it is, to be honest with you. But there's like another decision where he actually was the sole dissenter. It was a cross-burning case, and O'Connor wrote the decision. It was an 8-1 decision. It was in the early aughts, where she says that, and every other justice, including all the liberals, agree that cross-burning sometimes is a form of freedom of speech. It's a form of speech. It's expressive. And Thomas writes, a blistering dissent that I think now would be pretty much accepted by anybody who's a liberal or a Democrat, that in this country, cross-burning is everywhere and always one thing and one thing only. It's a mode of racial terrorism and intimidation. It's not a form of speech. So, there are certain things, but I think what's interesting about Thomas is not when he crosses over to the other side, it's when he comes up with these conservative arguments, but the route he takes there. That's what's really interesting about him.
Hi, thank you so much for navigating all these
Why
issues.
don't they bounce the
I'm
volume?
listening, and I just came back from a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship in Savannah. So it's fascinating to hear from them how they perceive their patron saint of democracy and liberty. Okay, so I see a lot of people like shocked or like, their disdain for him. But like, if you listen and you look through his racial lens of racial terror and you pan it out, everything that he does then makes sense. If you occupy that lens of racial terror, preservation, sustainability of the Black man, it makes perfect sense. So in this equation, ending racism would prevent someone like Clarence or the Clarences of the future from occupying such a high position in our government or just, writ large, anywhere in a position of power. It's racism. That's the variable in this equation. That's it. All of our disdain means nothing. So my question would be, is he grooming? Is he inspiring a new generation? Do you know anything about, because again, like, it's power, right? That's why he'll sit there and say, you know what? I was made fun of because I'm so dark skinned. I'm going to marry this white woman. Because again, it's racial terror. He wants power. So is he also inspiring a new generation of Black men? Do you know what that relationship is to others that may feel like, yeah, because that's really what it is. It's power and it's ending racism that is so convoluted that we get a Clarence Thomas. So are we going to get another Clarence in the future?
I mean, the history of Black conservative, I don't know if we get another Clarence Thomas in the future, but there's a long history of Black conservatism in this country, and he is one chapter in that history. He is certainly, I don't know whether recently, but he certainly spent quite a bit of time when he was on the court, meeting. He made a big point. He was the only justice who did it. I think Sonia Sotomayor now does this as well. Meeting with local youth and really, there's some very interesting and poignant moments in the reporting on this kind of stuff. And also certainly grooming clerks, both Black and white. So he's certainly, in fact, if anything, this was one of the things that early on it's so significant is that, he had the highest number of clerks appointed either to the judiciary by Trump or were in the Trump administration. So he certainly has created a network. Whether or not it's, about Black men and so forth, that I couldn't speak to really, but he certainly is aware of his legacy and trying to extend it.
I read your book.
Oh, thank you.
And there are a number of things that disappointed me. One was the questions I came to your book with. You didn't really answer in the book and stuff. But one was, you don't deal with the issue of social class. You never discussed why he chose the Holy Cross. I mean, there were better Catholic colleges. There's Notre Dame and, there's others. Did he go there the way Clinton went to Georgetown because he thought he could get the grades there to get into Yale? The second thing was where Thomas talked about the importance of black people working together and overcoming racism. Many African-American conservatives talk about the need to create internal support mechanisms among African-American communities. But if Thomas really believed that, and he was old enough, he knew of Malcolm, he knew of Elijah Muhammad, he knew of Marcus Garvey. They emphasized commercial, entrepreneurship and all that. If he really believed that, his jurisprudence would be very different. And you didn't really discuss that. There were certain internal contradictions about Terence Thomas that I thought.
Well, internal contradictions. I think that the questioner is presupposing that means that there must be some different formulation that doesn't have internal contradictions. But I would be very surprised if there has ever been a human in the history of the universe that did not have internal contradictions in their worldview.
Yeah, although I suspect that this person is not just merely pointing out the fact that they exist, but trying to highlight specific ones, probably, I hope.
Yeah, I guess we'll see.
Word enigma, would really go after. But you didn't really get into that, and I was frustrated.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I think I disagree with you on a couple of things. So, the issue of class is there in the book quite a bit, in a bunch of different respects. So we talked a bit about colorism and how it frames his whole sort of approach to class differences within the black community. And then I also talked about it quite a bit in this, which we didn't talk about here, but in his discussion about how he conceives of racial harms as stigmas. And it's very much a product of the class he now occupies. It's something that people in the professional classes are very concerned with. So I think class is pervasive, and it's in the book. But in terms of the second point about his jurisprudence would be different if he took seriously those ideas, I'm not sure how. As I said, what he takes from Garvey and from Malcolm X, Garvey says, don't go by the ballot. I can't remember. It's just in the black person should not depend on the ballot or resort to the government for protection. The government will be in the hands of the majority of the people who are prejudiced against him. That's exactly what Clarence Thomas believes. That's why black people should not put faith in the government or in the ballot, and instead should put faith in kind of entrepreneurialism and business creation. And all of his jurisprudence fits with that. It doesn't contradict that. So I actually do think that's at the center of the vision. There's all kinds of problems with it, but I don't think that part is inconsistent.
Thank you. From your talk here and, from, I guess, even a cursory review of Thomas's opinions, you can tell that he believes that there are a lot of things that have been considered rights that shouldn't be considered rights. But I gotta believe that there are at least like a handful that he's like, okay, no, these are sacrosanct. I'm assuming, interracial marriage, right? Like that's one. He's probably big on loving. But aside from that, what does this man look at and say, no, these we can keep? These we can keep for everybody in America.
So the right to bear arms, as I said, is it's a really important one. Thomas is, when it comes to freedom of speech, he's, there's a kind of libertarian wing of the conservative jurisprudence, and he's pretty solid on freedom of speech, particularly when it involves things like campaign finance and commercial speech, but even other freedom of religion, free exercise of religion. So most of the First Amendment freedoms, when it comes to freedom of assembly, I suspect not, but I hesitate because I don't really remember any distinctive opinions from him on that. But those rights, on search and seizure, like I said, on certain criminal justice things, again, there's a weird libertarian streak among some conservatives about that. So I think those are important. The interracial marriage and the loving thing is an interesting one. I'm glad you brought it up because in his abortion decision, he says, not his decision, his concurrence, he says, all of the, abortion, birth control, so the 1965 decision on birth control, gay marriage, and he leaves out interracial marriage, and people have thought, this is some kind of inconsistency. I really don't know where he's going to go with that question, but the only thing I would say is, well, I don't want to it gets very technical, but it is striking that he left that off the chopping block. He didn't mention it, so.
So thank you. Kind of a long-winded question, but in your other book, The Reactionary Mind, you argue really compellingly that the essence of conservatism is the defense of hierarchy. So for me, it's always.
I really don't like defining like the essence of conservatism or left wing, like in the universal sense. Like, okay, whatever.
In the question of how someone from a subjugated class like Clarence Thomas could become an arch conservative, kind of always, assumed, cynicism, self-interest, whatever. But now I think you weave a more compelling case. It's something that he really believes it. And there's a more, deeper worldview that, this world of hierarchy, cultivates this hardness that he's obsessed with. And I don't could you maybe speak more about that, the connection between the obsession with hardness and conservative, or just in general, like, if conservatism's defense of hierarchy, how does that square with Thomas's worldview?
Yeah. So I wrote this book, The Reactionary. Conservatism is always about the defense of hierarchy. But there's a second part of that argument, which is how to make hierarchy compelling in a society that is democratic. Right, where the masses are now a presence. And so this has always been the project of conservatism, is how to reconcile its very hierarchical vision in which there are a few excellent men who are entitled to govern and rule others, women, workers, black people. How to reconcile that vision with the fact that you have to make that philosophy broadly appealing. And so conservatism has always wrestled with this and has come up with a variety of ways that I discuss in that book. But I think Thomas is very consistent with that because he finds a place for black men in the conservative movement. And that's consistent with conservatism that finds a place, say, for a father, right? A father, a father of a family, who may not be, the father may not be particularly rich, right? He might be economically quite poor, he might be socially marginalized, but boy, in that home, he's a little despot, right? He's a little king, right? And so I think that idea, it fits with with Thomas's vision, right, of these black male patriarchs who are not, in terms of the society as a whole, particularly revered figures of high status, but within their communities are. And I think that would be the connection between the two. And it is, as you say, it's a very sincere vision. This is not. It's sincere. Yeah.
We have time for one final question.
Thank you. Thank you both for a really wonderful, enlightening evening. is he at peace with himself? I mean, he seems at once so angry, and I mean, for all these claims he makes about his intellectual rigor and the originalism, I mean, I've been reading very deeply about Bruin, for example. I mean, serious historians and legal people think it's quite literally the worst, most intellectually bankrupt Supreme Court decision in the history of Supreme Court decisions. I mean, even this, Bruin, the New York, the gun law, the most recent gun law. And even, for example, the idea, frankly, the citation you made about cross-burning, it was itself understood as terror. That's what possession of a gun was understood as from like the very earliest English common law. I mean, for a person who claims at once to be so intellectual, he seems so motivated by emotion and anger. For a person who he's simultaneously so engaged in a historical view. I mean, he can't update a reality to like a Barack Obama becoming president. I mean, how do you make sense? Does he try to make sense? Does he think he makes sense? Does he think he's an intellectual? I mean, I don't know. He's just.
Yeah.
I don't know how I'm having difficulty with all these contradictions. And if there's any through line.
This is her problem.
He can see or you can see through it. My apologies on the incoherence
She's
of that.
projecting.
No, I understand I mean, I think, yeah. I think we have, and it's a very recent idea about Supreme Court justices. The bulk of them have been recently, all from Harvard and Yale, Harvard or Yale Law School. The bulk of them many of them have been professors. Many of them have been, longstanding jurists. For most of the Supreme Court's history, that was actually not the case. Hugo Black, one of the revered figures of the Warren Court, was a senator from, in fact, a former Klan member, but was a senator from Alabama. He had to, was no, Earl Warren was a governor from California. And the reason I bring that up is, for most of the Supreme Court's history, Supreme Court justices were political figures. They weren't intellectuals, they weren't academics, they weren't professors. And I think Thomas is part of that tradition of the Supreme Court as political actors, speaking a particular kind of language that has certain kind of constraints and forms that you have to honor and observe, right? It's not like Tom DeLay. I feel like Tom DeLay now seems like an intellectual compared to what's going on today, but whatever. So they're not. It's not a free for all, but it's also not an academic seminar. These opinions, and so I guess that would be the way I would. I don't know exactly what's in Thomas's head about whether he's an intellectual or not, whether he's at peace with himself. I mean, these are decisions that are often blistering. But that's true, that was true of Antonin Scalia. I mean, Scalia was notorious. So I think behind the question is the notion that he's not, he's not, as you said, not an intellectual. And I guess I would challenge the premise of the question, which is, throughout American history, most Supreme Court justices were not intellectuals.
Oh my gosh, this audio.
Yeah. I'm hoping to God he's going to repeat the question into the mic.
Oh, well, if that's the issue there,
shit.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, I think you're definitely right. But I also think he's talked about original. I mean, the last part of the book is a way that he talks about originalism in a way that's extremely personal, and I don't think he sees it as. I mean, Scalia was the big one who talked about the impersonality of original. I mean, Thomas doesn't do that much. So I don't know if that's as much of an inconsistency there. But yes, I agree that the personal, political, ideological elements are front and center. And so it's not a kind of academic, law professor's idea of the law. But all I would say is that most Supreme Court opinions read the Brown decision. Right? It's from an academic law point of view, it's not exactly up there, at the levels of reasoning. It was a political statement, and I don't see that as a kind of a mark, frankly, as a mark. I mean, I think all of these things are quite political.
Thank you.
That's an interesting opinion there that I've not heard expressed before. I've always heard the context, or I've always heard conversations about the political nature of the Supreme Court in the context of it's getting more political. It's getting far, far, far more political as time goes on. I'd be super interested to hear him go into that more, but I suspect he's not going to.
Thank you both so much, and thank you all for.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I've heard exactly that thing before either, but it is interesting to, to say that like apparently the Supreme Court justices today are all like law professors, when once upon a time they were more likely to be politicians. I mean, that's a noteworthy fact that does kind of play against the popular narrative on that subject. I tend to not think very much of the argument about whether the Supreme Court is super political or not. I sort of think that it is it's just always inherently going to be a political institution, and the idea that it shouldn't be is a little bit like pie in the sky.
I think it's a question of degrees and also the surrounding context. I think that the increasing pressure and political pressure on an increasing political nature of the Supreme Court in recent times is basically a direct result of the gridlock in Congress. I think it's the same reason why DACA was done through executive action is the same reason why Republican abortion policy was done through the Supreme Court, and that is because it is becoming increasingly difficult for Congress to pass significant legislation that's controversial.
Well, and another thing that it's essentially people complaining about the specific way in which the court is political, but they're not going to say that. They're just going to say like, oh, the court is politicizing the court is becoming more political, or like another thing that you'll hear in the news sometimes it's like, oh, why are they politicizing gun violence or something like that? But it's like. I think the subtext of those kind of comments is I don't like the specific way in which this is becoming political, or I don't like the specific way in which this is being politicized, but it just sounds like a more powerful attack to just complain that it is becoming more political. Because it's kind of like invoking this ideal that people have of the Supreme Court as this like impartial arbiter of justice that's just I don't know, calling the shots as they see them and without any regard to their ideologies that they bring to it. But that's just an unrealistic ideal. I think these are human beings and they're making decisions based on their human beliefs. Do you have anything else you want to add, either about this video or about Clarence Thomas or the court or anything?
No, I thought it was a fascinating look at Clarence Thomas. So I was totally uninformed on the issue prior to this. So I would want to maybe double check if there's any strong criticisms of this book before I went out, claiming, guys, Thomas Terrence is actually a black nationalist accelerationist. But it gave me a lot to think about in a non-ironic way.
Okay, I'm gonna go offline in a minute. Do you want to shout yourself out? Or?
Twitch.tv/Flowtrace, twitter.com/Flowtrace. I'm on Kick too, kick.com/Flowtrace. I'll be live Friday on a WIC panel talking about pornography and whether or not pornography should be judged for its racist content and sexist content in the way that we would judge other social media content.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you for joining me. See you next time.
Yeah, I'll see you.